Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I need to make some moss poles today, but I thought I'd use the opportunity to do a little Q&A. You asked me some questions on Instagram and I'm going to answer them for you today. Now, around moss poles in themselves, I have a more in-depth tutorial, which I'll link at the end screen as well. So I won't talk you through the process of making moss poles step by step today. Just have a look at that video if you haven't looked at it already. But I'm planning on making 6 moss poles. I think it's just so much easier to make them in bulk rather than just making one at a time. I'm using a 500-gram pack of dried moss. I obviously re-moistened it, but that 500-gram pack of dried moss should make around about 6 moss poles, but we'll see how we go. All of my materials are from Bunnings, so if you're in Australia, happy days. If you're not from Australia, but you have managed to source similar ingredients, just leave a comment below for anybody else who might be interested in knowing whereabouts you can find the wire or the moss or cable ties and so on. So I think that way we can all help each other out. I use a wire rather than plastic because the wire is just so much stronger. Question number 1. I was asked how I manage for my plants to root into the moss pole so quickly. Well, it's pretty easy. Roots seek moisture. So if you do a good job at keeping your moss poles moist, then the roots will automatically find their way into the moss pole. Sometimes the roots also wrap around the moss pole. They don't just go straight in, but it doesn't matter. Roots are roots, you know. That's how they grow in nature, right? In nature, they would kind of wrap themselves around a tree or any sort of host. But yeah, if you keep your moss pole moist, then the roots will automatically grow into the moss pole. Now, I keep my moss pole moist just by putting a water bottle upside down. But of course, I have a more in-depth tutorial on watering moss poles as well, which will also be linked at the end screen. I have them all in a moss pole playlist, and I'll just link the playlist at the end so you can have a look at any of these topics in a little bit more depth if required. Next question was how I managed to so simply make my plants thrive. I do take that as a compliment that you think it looks so easy or so simple in the way that I do it. And that's really the goal, right? I wanted to make sure that I get an approach, or I develop an approach, and I didn't develop it. Like, it was inspired by many other people on the internet who have been looking after plants for years before I even started my hobby. So definitely none of my approaches are unique to me. But yeah, I think if once you know what you're doing and you've done it a couple of times, it will just eventually become really repetitive. And that's when you become really good at something. If you're doing it for the first time, of course, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. You don't really know what you're doing yet. You don't know what to expect. But if you do it 10, 15 times, eventually you can just do it with your eyes closed. I've made so many moss poles in my life. I've done so many chop and extends. I've done endless waterings, repottings, and so on. And with every time you do something, you learn a little bit more about it. So practice makes perfect, or not perfect, but practice makes mastery. Mastery is something like that. You know what I mean? So yeah, just keep doing what you're doing. Keep practicing. It took me over 2 years of growing plants quite successfully, actually, until I really found the confidence to say, let's make a YouTube channel out of this, because I wasn't too sure if am I just being really lucky? Am I just accidentally doing all the right things so my plants are thriving? Or do I actually know what I'm doing? And I'm still not 100% sure if I actually know what I'm doing or if I'm just lucky. But I suppose by now I've got the results to kind of back me up. So but it took me a good 2 years until I got to that point. So yeah, don't feel discouraged at the beginning if you feel like this is so hard. Everything new you start, every hobby, every sport you do, at the beginning when you don't know what you're doing, it always feels so hard. But eventually it will become second nature. So yeah, that's the fun part, right? So another question was how I manage for my plants to not tip over. So obviously a lot of my plants are quite tall. So the ones behind me, for example, are all on 180 centimeter poles, and they are in just 20 centimeter pots. So, you know, especially once they grow up and grow large leaves, they do look super top heavy. And yeah, sometimes they are a bit top heavy as well. I mean, I'm pretty careful with them when I put them down, when I move them. But if you've seen my Instagram reels, I'm not actually that careful with them. Yeah, honestly, I think if you construct a moss pole that is structurally sound. So if you use a good wire rather than using plastic, and if you make them into a nice cylinder, because a cylinder is quite a strong shape, they stand up by themselves, right? So I don't need to do much to actually stabilize them. Now, obviously, once there's a plant on it, it gets a little bit tougher, but I'll just pop that in a pot with chunky aeroid mix. The chunky aeroid mix also kind of helps to keep it in place. When I extend it, I put a garden stake at the back as well, but it's mainly to connect the two poles rather than actually giving it additional stability. And then I take the nursery pot and I put the nursery pot into a more heavier decorative planter. And I think that's really what's giving it most of the stability, so that it's not just wobbling around and becoming top heavy. That heavy planter makes it look good. It provides shade for the roots, but it also gives it a bit of stability. So I think that's it. I mean, I've seen people cable tie their poles to the pot, but that doesn't stop the thing from falling over, right? Like if it's top heavy and it wants to fall, then it's just going to fall with the pot attached to it. So you're not really solving that problem just by attaching your pole. I've seen people actually hang their poles rather than having them stand. I suppose that would also give you a lot more stability, having them hang. But yeah, I honestly don't do too much. If you're really struggling with your moss poles falling over, I would think that it's probably an issue with the construction of your moss pole. So maybe the moss pole isn't really stable in itself, so you're not really giving it a good start. And then obviously everything from there, once you then have a plant on it and then you extend it and so on, it's just going to become less and less stable. Also, if you potentially have a pole that is made out of multiple smaller sections, then every joint is a weak spot. So you increase the chances of the plant falling over, the moss pole caving in with every extension that you do. So that's why I always use just two poles, two 90 centimeter poles, and have just one joint where they meet. Which leads me to the next question. Somebody asked why I always start my small plants on a large pole. Why don't I just use a small pole first, and then once the plant grows up, just switch the pole around? If you are keeping your moss pole moist and the plant is rooting into the moss pole, you can't just switch the moss pole halfway through. The moss pole and the plant are one, right? There's no distinction between the pole and the plant anymore. It just becomes one. So when you chop it, I chop both. I chop the moss pole and the plant. So that's why I like to start with a large moss pole straight away, because I have that long-term vision and I know it's going to climb up that large moss pole eventually anyway, and I do not want to have all of these small extensions. It would be way too much work, and as I said earlier, it would also make the whole construction of the moss pole less structurally sound. Somebody asked if I ever experienced browning of leaves, and of course I do. Plants are plants. They're not perfect. If you go into the rainforest, you don't see perfect plants, not at all, right? In nature, there's animals and insects and whatnot climbing on them. There's lots of heavy winds. You know, and leaves have a limited time span. Leaves are not meant to last forever. If you want a leaf or a plant to not change and last forever, then, I mean, as much as I hate to say it, like, get a plastic plant, right? Like, but if you want to grow a proper plant, like browning of leaves, leaves dying, you know, that's totally part of the whole process. So I'm never concerned if I see any leaves with brown tips, especially not if they're the ones at the bottom of the pole or like the oldest leaves, right? Maybe if the newest leaves start going brown or yellow, then maybe it's a sign that something is wrong with the plant. But browning of tips could just be lack of humidity, could just be that the leaf is getting old, the plant is really taking the energy back out of the leaf and putting it towards maybe new leaves or re-establishing a root system. Especially when you propagate as well, that leaf that you use to propagate is most likely going to yellow pretty quickly because the plant just doesn't have enough energy to sustain that leaf while it's working on building a root system. And it's a good thing. Leaves come and go. As long as you make sure that your root system is happy, you don't really have to worry about anything. Now, you can give these moss poles a bit of a haircut as well. You can just kind of cut it a little bit. It will reduce the mess that the moss pole makes on later on. If you've made a moss pole before, you would have noticed that at the beginning it sheds a bit of moss like this, but that will stop eventually as well. So it's really just at the beginning. Eventually it will stop. Sometimes I can't really be asked to give it a haircut, then I'll just leave it as it is. So yeah, browning of leaves. Of course I get brown edges. I honestly just cut them off. I don't like the look of them, so I just cut them. I don't really care. Closely related to that question is, you know, people ask me, why is my leaf going yellow? Why is my leaf going brown? And so on. There can be so many reasons why something goes yellow and or brown. It could be overwatering, it could be underwatering, it could be too much light, it could be too little light, it could be an infection, bacterial or fungal. Hey, Brad. Could be over-fertilizing. Honestly, there's so many possibilities. Unless you kind of know what happened to the plant, what it's been through over the last few weeks, where it's located, what the conditions are it's growing in and so on, it's going to be really hard to actually determine what exactly went wrong with the plant. I would say most likely, if your leaves are going yellow and going yellow pretty quickly, it might have something to do with the health of the root system. So either over or under watering. But again, that might not be the case. It could also be an infection or something like that. So it's really hard to determine just over Instagram or by somebody sending me a photo. And quite honestly, I don't have enough experience to make a judgment call on any of those things. But again, if this yellowing or browning is just something on the oldest leaf of your plant or the oldest couple of leaves, or if it happens right after you cut it or after you changed the position of it, then I wouldn't be concerned at all. It's normal for a plant to go through a bit of shock. And the first thing a plant does when it goes through some shock is it just sucks the energy back into its root system and its stem, so it aborts a couple of leaves, but it would always abort the oldest leaves. Or sometimes it might abort a leaf that is just about to unfurl if it doesn't have enough energy to really see it through. So if you potentially cut like a tip cutting, sometimes the growth tip is actually gonna die. So I personally don't actually like tip cuttings. I always like stem cuttings. I find them much easier to root, and I find them easier to reshoot as well. They just kind of give you a new shoot, and usually they reshoot quite large as well. So I always love a good stem cutting. I was asked what climbing plant, specifically what climbing philodendron, would be good to start off with for somebody who's new to this hobby. If you want a philodendron, I'd say that any philodendron that is not velvet is usually a little bit easier to take care of. So, for example, the Atabapoense that I did this plant spotlight on recently, I think that's fairly easy to take care of, and it was one of my first plants that I started learning with. If you'd like a velvet philodendron, I would definitely go for any of the hybrids. So the hybrids, as I mentioned in my previous video as well, they kind of get the best of both worlds. So they are usually more tolerant to lower humidity, to pests, and so on. So like a Philodendron Splendid, a Philodendron Glorious, I would highly recommend to start off with those rather than going into your pure species straight away, like Verrucosums, Melanos. They can be quite tricky. So I would always start off with one of the hybrids first. And then once you feel confident with the hybrids, you know that you have conditions that work for them, then maybe start getting into the species. The hybrids will also be so much more rewarding to grow. They grow up much faster. They're less maintenance work. So you'll do yourself a favor and, stay motivated. Otherwise, if you start with a really tricky plant, it's really easy to get demotivated and think, oh, this plant hobby is not for me. People always say that I've got a green thumb. Like, green thumb is just a skill. It's like saying to a sports person saying like, oh, you've got great legs or whatever. It's like, well, they trained hard for them, right? Like, they go to the gym every day, so they are good at their sport. So I look after my plants almost every day, so I'm good with them and I understand what they want and what they need. So yeah, apart from that, if you're not stuck on a philodendron, I would highly recommend starting with Monstera as a genus. So Monstera adansonii, for example, of course Monstera deliciosa is probably one of the most common houseplants anyway. I think you can definitely start with those. They're more tolerant to drying out, they're more tolerant to lower humidities, and they are usually quite readily available at garden stores. So even if you kill it through trial and error, you might have learned a lesson, you killed a plant, but it's okay, you should be able to replace it quite easily. Or start with a pothos, start with a, they're readily available. I'm sure we all have a friend with a pothos at home. Just ask for a cutting, propagate it in water, and then pop it on a moss pole and see if you've got the conditions and care requirements for it to work, and then kind of approach some more finicky, trickier plants that might also come with a higher price tag. So by then, you don't need to be afraid to cut it or do anything with it because you gained enough confidence in your skills. I was asked if plants really need a moss pole. Of course they don't need a moss pole. They need light and water. That's what they really need. In nature, there are no moss poles either, right? The moss pole is kind of just trying to mimic a tree that these climbing aeroids would climb up in nature. Now, you don't need a moss pole to mimic a tree. A bamboo stick, a piece of wood, I don't know, like I think I've seen people use felt, you could use a PVC pipe, all of that, as long as it's like a vertical type of support or cocoa coir pole, it's a vertical type of support, it will mimic the tree. So the plant will be able to kind of somewhat attach to it and then climb up. So you don't need a moss pole. But the reason I chose moss poles is because I think it gives the plant the best opportunity to actually thrive and mature. Now, we are not growing these plants in their native environment. We are not growing them in a jungle. If you'd be living, some of you might be living in a climate that is very, very close to the native conditions of most of these tropical plants, and you can probably just pop them outside and they're thriving irrespective of what you do. But in an indoor setting, we are already quite far away from their natural conditions. So anything you can do to kind of improve the way that the plant can grow indoors, I think is a worthwhile thing to do. So I know that I have limited space in an indoor setting, for example, and I know that a plant like my Adansonii, for example, would need to climb at least 3 or 4 meters for it to actually throw out large mature leaves. You won't get that plant to mature within just a 1.5 meter time span or like a small pole, right? You will need length to actually get it to grow because it's just not getting enough light. It's getting some light, but we're indoors, right? There's a bloody ceiling above me. It's never going to get as much light as it would in nature. So because it's not getting enough light, I'm expecting the growth to be a little bit slower and leggier than it would be in nature. So I need to provide it enough height for it to actually grow until it matures. So my Adansonii has probably gone through about 3 meters worth of pole at this stage to get to that size that it's in right now. And of course, having a 3 meter pole indoors is not really realistic. So I know that I need to cut that plant halfway through. But every time you cut a plant, the plant is going to go through a bit of shock. It essentially just lost all of its root system, so it will kind of revert back to being juvenile. So the way I think I can kind of counteract that the best is by having these moss poles, because every single node is already rooted, meaning that it doesn't really matter when or where I cut it. The plant always has a decent root system available, so it can pretty much continue to mature almost as if nothing happened. If you have it on a bamboo pole or a wooden pole or like just a piece of wood, like, yes, it will root into that piece of wood potentially, but it's more anchoring. It's not really, these are not water roots. They're not roots that are going to absorb water and roots, despite the fact that there is no water. Like, your bamboo is not going to retain any water. Neither is your cocoa coir. So they're just anchoring roots. They're still sending the plant a signal that, hey, we are climbing, we can mature now, but they're not adding the propagation benefit. They're not increasing the actual root system to be able to absorb more water and nutrients. But the moss pole does that. The moss pole is basically an extension of the pot. Moss is a potting medium, whereas wood or bamboo is not a potting medium. So anyway, very passionate about this topic quite clearly. So basically, in a nutshell, yes, you can use any other type of support for sure, but just be aware that they are just supports. They're not extension of your pot. They're not extensions of your growing medium. So you will not have the same benefits when it comes to creating a large root system, having propagation benefits, because essentially every node is air layered and so on. So definitely you don't need it, but it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to grow these plants to maturity as fast as possible? Are you trying to optimize the potential that this plant has? Or are you just happy to have it sit in a corner and you want it to be low maintenance? Then go for it. Give it whatever support you want. Just have realistic expectations based on the care approach that you're taking. I definitely talked way too much about that topic, but yeah, you can tell I was asked this question a few times over the last 3 years, and I've had plenty of time to think about my answer. You'll notice that I also leave the bottom part of the moss pole empty. That's because that bottom part will be inside the actual nursery pot, so I'll fill that with aeroid mix at the time of potting up the plant. If you want to see how I pot up a plant, I have a video where I pot up my Monstera subpinnata, and guess what? It's in that playlist that I'll link at the end screen. Good segue into the next question. I often get asked, or actually most often get told, not asked, that my pots are way too small for my plants and I have to repot them. And yeah, that's a hard no from me. I do not need to repot them. All of this is potting medium. I'm just extending the pot vertically rather than just giving it a larger pot, but it's essentially the same. It will give the plant a root system or room for a root system. And the good thing as well is that every single node has its own root system. So by the time the plant reaches the top, it doesn't rely on nutrients coming from all the way at the bottom. Every single node can get its own water and its own nutrients. And that's just what makes it so much easier for the plant to grow fast and thrive. So no, I do not need to repot. In general, I actually like using smaller pots. I prefer my plants being root bound. It gives me less chances of potentially overwatering the plant. And if you feed your plant on a regular basis, and we talk about fertilizer in the next question, then you don't have to worry about there not being enough nutrients for the plant to actually thrive either. So yeah, I think it's one of these myths, right? Like when people start their plant journey, people think they need to repot their plant all the time for it to grow, but I don't think that's the case. People think you need to give a plant a large pot for it to grow large. Not at all. It's quite the opposite, actually. If you have a really large pot, sometimes the plant just continues growing roots and doesn't really focus on the leaves. Or if you have a very large pot, there's just way too much medium that can retain moisture, which means that you have to water it very infrequently. Or the top dries out really quickly. The bottom is still moist. Your plant hasn't even reached the bottom of the pot yet because it's so small and that pot is so large. So there's many reasons why a large pot isn't really good, but also it just takes up way too much space. Like I don't have that much space. I want to keep the footprint of my plants as small as possible, so I can fit as many plants as possible in my apartment, right? So yeah, I think all of my plants, apart from the Adansonii, because the Adansonii just is rooting like crazy, and I have got 3 plants in there. All of them are just in 20 centimeter pots. The Adansonia is in a 25 centimeter pot, and that's the largest one I have. Good segue into the next question. People ask me, how many plants do I have in each pot? It really depends. It depends on what look I'm going for. It depends on how many of a plant I have available as well. I usually prefer having a few of each plant in one pot just to create a lush pole, right? My goal is essentially to not be able to see the pole anymore. I want it to be covered by leaves. But it really depends on the plant in itself. My dubia, for example, I just have 1 plant on there because I think it really shows that transformation of that one plant that it goes through. I don't want it to be lush. I wanted to see that one plant and 1 leaf at a time. Whereas my micans, for example, I think by now there's probably at least 10 vines on there that is growing up and down, up and down. I've got some with 3, I've got some with 2, I've got some with just 1. I've got, like, it's just super random, honestly. Just really think about what you want that plant to look like in a few years' time or in a few months' time, and then act accordingly. Yeah, there's no right or wrong, just personal preference. So do whatever floats your boat. How do I stop my moss pots from getting moldy? There's three things to this. After I make them, because I had to moisten the moss to make them, just so I can spread it easily, I'll actually put them out on the balcony and I'll put them in the sun just for them to dry. So I want to store them when they're dry. And then I just re-wet them when I put my first plant on it. And by the way, that worked perfectly with the 6 poles for 1 pack for 6 poles. Perfect. Yeah, so I don't know if there's any scientific evidence behind that or if that's just hearsay, but I think maybe the sun might kill some of the mold that might be in there. But I think first and foremost, it's good. It's important to get a good quality sphagnum moss. Here in Australia, we've got sustainably harvested premium sphagnum moss available at Bunnings. It's the brand is called Brunnings, and I haven't had any issue using that moss from that brand. So it's really good. I think maybe sometimes if it was stored incorrectly after or before packaging, so not your fault, so whoever produces it or farms and harvests it. So if it's stored incorrectly over there, I think then maybe you might have mold, and then once you do have mold, it's probably a bit harder to get rid of it. I haven't really had any issues. To prevent mold from forming in the first place, you need to make sure there's airflow, but that's not specific to just moss poles. I mean, with everything, especially if you are one of these people that likes to mist, if you mist your plants and you don't have airflow, like fungal issues are going to be imminent. So just make sure you have sufficient airflow. So I like to keep my windows open when possible. I always have a fan on, or at least a couple of times a day. I make sure that I turn on the fan, especially after I water or after I spray any of my plants for pests or to clean them. Always make sure that I have a fan on so there's no water droplets on the plants and staying for too long, because that's kind of what causes fungus. And the same goes for the moss pole. The moss pole in itself has such a large surface area, it dries out pretty quickly. So it should be fairly easy to prevent mold because it dries out so quickly. But I suppose you're trying to keep it moist. Maybe you're keeping it too moist as well. Maybe you're judging the moisture of your moss pole just purely based on the surface, and then you just keep spraying it, but the inside hasn't even dried out yet. So if just the surface of your moss pole is dry, you should still be okay. Give it another couple of days before you actually water it. So maybe you're overwatering your moss pole, and that's what's causing mold. Mold also doesn't like sunlight, so probably you have a really wet moss pole full of not so premium moss in a dark corner with no airflow. That's probably what's causing your mold issues. So put it in a brighter corner, stop watering it that much, give it airflow, and ideally, I mean, that's just kind of going to prevent the mold, but if you already have mold, you might want to find an antifungal spray and see if that kind of solves your issues. Whoops. But yeah, hard for me to talk about it because I always like to talk from experience, and I just haven't really experienced it. So I can only guess what the issue might be, but I can't say for certain. So that's not really usually how I like to roll. Alrighty, so I'll pop these onto the balcony to let them dry out before I store them. Alrighty, and while I clean up, there were a couple more questions around fertilizer and pest treatment. Right, I've been a bit hesitant to answer these sort of questions because I just don't feel like I'm very educated on these things. I just use products that were recommended to me, and they somewhat work, or at least the fertilizer works really well. My pest treatment, I just feel like I'm really lucky. So I just don't think I've have enough experience with pests and pest treatment, with trying different nutrients to really talk about it in depth. That's why I've kind of been avoiding this topic. I don't like to talk about theory. I like to talk about my real experiences and share them with you. But I've just been getting asked so many times, and I don't want to come across as withholding important information from you or being cagey. If I don't talk about something, it's just because I honestly don't know much more about it, so I don't have anything else to say. But this is what I use from a fertilizer perspective. It's a company called Growth Australia. I use mainly this product over here, Foliage Focus, and I use this weekly. So every week when I water my plants, I put 5 milliliters of this nutrient into my water before I water my plants. And that goes for moss poles and any plants that are not moss poles. So honestly, all of them. The CCS is, and so obviously the foliage focuses on foliage, so growing large leaves. It doesn't make your plants flower, for example. So if you have like an orchid and you want to see it flower, there is a different focus range for orchids, orchid bloom, I think. I'll link the description. I'll link their website in the description anyway, so you can check it out. The other one that I use is CCS. Same 5 milliliters in 1 liter of water, but I use this for plants that aren't rooted yet. So for example, if I just root a cutting in water, I put a bit of this in my water. Once I pot it up, the first couple of weeks, I use this. So this really helps the plant focus on the root system. And then once I'm happy with the root system, I'll then switch to foliage focus so the plant can then focus on its leaves. Now, my understanding, and I could be wrong, but check out their website to kind of, learn a little bit more about their products. But they were developed here in Australia over decades of research. And what is amazing about them is that they're not a fertilizer. A fertilizer usually relies on bacteria in your soil to break down the compounds and make them available for the plants to use. These are nutrients. They're not a fertilizer. They're plant nutrients, meaning that I can feed that to my plants and the plant can absorb the nutrients straight away without the need for the nutrients to be broken down into its compounds first. So that's why I feed it weekly, because then my plant has a consistent flow of nutrients available at all times and can continue to grow and can continue to thrive. I do that throughout the entire year. Maybe once or twice a year, I just give it the week where I just flush all the nutrients out, because sometimes I do have a bit of mineral buildup, not to the extent that my plants would be harmed, quite clearly, but I usually just continue fertilizing or giving them nutrients throughout the whole year, even winter. If your plant is growing, it needs food. If you're in Sydney, you can go to growing grounds and get them over there. AJ also ships everywhere within Australia. So I'll link AJ's Instagram and website in the description. If you're overseas, I have no idea if it's available in your country at this stage or not. I know that GT is expanding to different markets one by one, but I don't know. I can't keep track of all of this, but I'll link their Instagram in the description below. So just shoot them a DM and check if they have suppliers in the country that you live in. When it comes to pest treatment, I use basically just two things. I use Vitality Plus and I use Confidor spray. So this Confidor spray from Bayer, I just Googled it and I just bought it at the first available store. I'm pretty sure it was an Australian store, so I'm not too sure if everybody can order from there. But if you just Google Confidor from Bayer, and it's this green bottle, it should be pretty easy to find. But I will link the store that I bought it from down below. So that Confidor spray is, I've used it for thrips, and so far I have nothing but good things to say about it. It really gets rid of the thrips within 1 or maximum 2 applications. So that's really, really good. The pest I have to deal with the most are spider mites, and I use Vitality Plus for spider mites. I also get it from AJ at Growing Grounds. So again, her Instagram is below, so you can check out her shop. I've heard people on the internet say that this is fancy looking soap water and technically it shouldn't do anything for your spider mites. I can tell you that it does help with my spider mite issue when I have one. I usually try and treat my plants as soon as I see the first sign of spider mites. So it's not an infestation yet, and it's definitely okay for that purpose. If you have a larger infestation, so the spider mites have really started to, make themselves feel home, I'm not too sure how effective it will be with dealing with that, because I just honestly haven't had to deal with it. So I personally can recommend it, but it's definitely not eradicating my spider mite issue at all. They will eventually come back. So it is a continuous battle between me and spider mites. At this stage, it seems like I'm winning, but I need to keep on top of it. I can't rest on my previous victories. So I can recommend it, but I'm sure somebody in the comment section has a much better idea. I've heard people use neem oil, but I've also heard the same about neem oil. It's an organic pest treatment, and it's probably not going to be strong enough if you have a really hardcore infestation, right? But it's probably good for preventative purposes and so on. Alrighty, I think that's it for today. I've got plenty of moss posts to keep potting up some plants, keep extending some of my plants. So I'm excited. It's been way too long. I kind of procrastinated for a good 2 months to make more poles. So I'm glad I gotten on top of it now. And as I said earlier, I highly recommend that if you go through the effort of getting all the materials, making a mess, just make a bunch of poles in one rather than just making one at a time, because otherwise you're just going to keep on procrastinating. If you're still listening, thank you so much for sticking through. I hope you got some value out of this little informal Q&A and just having a bit of a chat with me, despite the fact me doing most of the talking. Anyway, please feel free to like and subscribe, share my videos with your friends if you think they can benefit from it. Take care and happy growing. Bye.